Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're diving into serverless computing, a topic I know you're all eager to know more about. And let's be real, it's one of those buzzwords that's like everywhere right now.
It's true.
Yeah.
It is. Everywhere you turn, someone's talking about serverless.
Right, kind of like Synergy was back in the day, But hopefully with a bit more substance this time around.
Hopefully.
So, to help us cut through the hype, we're taking a deep dive into an episode from the CloudBenders podcast. They seem to have a pretty good handle on all things cloud, so it seemed like the perfect place to start.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, so right off the bat, the podcast hosts, they used this analogy that I thought was actually pretty clever. They compared serverless computing to, get this, using Uber.
Okay, I can see where they're going with this.
Right. So, obviously you still need a car, right? But you're not the one who has to worry about owning it, maintaining it, any of that.
Exactly. And that's a great way to understand how cloud computing in general has been moving towards more and more abstraction.
Yeah.
It's like we've gone from owning the entire car with virtual machines to maybe renting a car with containers.
Mm-hmm.
And now with serverless, it's like we're just hopping in that Uber and paying for the ride.
Okay, that's a really clear way to put it. But I guess for someone who's building software or even just using a software application, what difference does this whole abstraction thing actually make?
Well, it boils down to a potential shift in focus and a huge leap in efficiency. Imagine this. No more spending precious time and resources, setting up servers, configuring networks, or even stressing about downtime. All of a sudden, you don't need to be a mechanic to drive.
Okay, I like where you're going with this. So more time to actually focus on what makes the software valuable in the first place.
Exactly. Serverless lets developers pour their energy into the core of the application, into the code that really delivers value to users.
That makes a lot of sense. And speaking of code, the podcast dives into this thing called functions as a service, FaaS, which they call the dominant serverless model.
It's a mouthful for sure.
It is. So can you break that down for us? What is this FaaS thing all about?
Absolutely. So picture this. You're taking your application, and instead of it being this big monolithic thing, you're breaking it down into these smaller independent functions.
Okay, I'm picturing it. Each function is what, a mini program?
In a way, yes. Think of each function as a specialized worker with one specific task to do.
So to use the e-commerce example that the podcast used, if I'm buying something online, one function would be processing the payment, another one updates my order, and another one sends out that, hey, thanks for your money email.
Exactly. You've got it.
Mm-hmm.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Each of those functions, those little workers, only actually starts working, springs to life when it's actually needed. No orders, no need to have them standing by.
So that's where the whole cost-saving thing comes in.
You got it. No more paying for idle time.
That's pretty incredible. It's like having this team of on-demand digital workers, each with their own little specialty, just waiting to clock in when needed.
That's a great way to think about it.
And the best part is, I'm guessing you don't even have to be the one to manage all these little digital workers.
Exactly. That's the beauty of it. The cloud provider takes care of everything. The server maintenance, the software updates, all the behind-the-scenes stuff. It's like having a whole IT department that you don't have to pay for.
Okay, so we're talking serious efficiency here. And speaking of efficiency, the CloudBenders episode, they really hammered home this point about cost-effectiveness being a major win for serverless. They made it seem like a game changer, especially for businesses that have, those unpredictable spikes in traffic.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where the pay-as-you-go model of serverless really shines.
Mm-hmm.
Think about it this way. With traditional cloud setups, you're often paying for server uptime, even when your application is basically, taking a nap.
Right, just sitting there, using up resources and costing money.
Exactly. But serverless flips the script. You only pay for the actual compute time those functions use. It's like instead of paying rent on an apartment you barely use, you only pay for the nights you actually sleep there.
Okay, that's a fantastic analogy. So we could be talking serious cost savings here.
Absolutely. We're potentially talking about slashing your cloud bill, maybe even up to 70%, depending on your use case. That's the power of serverless cost efficiency.
Wow, 70%, that's huge. I bet businesses with those fluctuating or just unpredictable traffic patterns, they must be over the moon about this kind of potential saving.
Absolutely. It's a game changer for them. And speaking of traffic, that's the other major advantage of serverless that the podcast highlighted. Automatic scaling. Remember those Black Friday sales and those nightmare stories of websites crashing under the pressure?
Yeah, those Black Friday crashes, those are legendary. I mean, not in a good way, obviously.
Right. Talk about a retailer's worst nightmare. But yeah, with serverless, those meltdowns, they could become a thing of the past.
Okay, so how does serverless actually prevent that?
So picture this. It's Black Friday, the internet's on fire, everyone's trying to buy like 10 Instant Pots at once.
The classic Black Friday staple.
Right. So with serverless, as the traffic surges, the cloud provider automatically spins up more instances of those little worker functions we talked about. No human intervention needed. No one has to like frantically call the IT department at 3:00 a.m. It just scales to meet the demand.
Okay, yeah. That kind of peace of mind, that's got to be priceless for businesses, especially, like you said, those dealing with, those customers who expect everything to just work perfectly no matter what.
It's true. It's table stakes these days. And, by taking away a lot of that headache of managing all the infrastructure, serverless lets those businesses really focus on what matters, their core offerings, creating amazing experiences for their customers.
Right. Makes sense. So we've covered cost efficiency, we've got automatic scaling, and the podcast also mentioned this other big win for serverless, which is it lets developers really focus on the code, the fun stuff, not so much the infrastructure stuff.
Absolutely. And that is huge for developers. I mean, no one got into this profession to spend all day messing around with servers.
Right. They want to be creative, build cool things.
Exactly. Serverless abstracts away a lot of that complexity. It's like saying to developers, hey, you know what? Don't worry about the plumbing. Go build something amazing.
I love that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of really awesome advantages, but no technology is perfect, right? And the CloudBenders episode, they definitely didn't shy away from some of the potential downsides of serverless. So one thing that they mentioned was this thing called cold starts, which I'll be honest, I don't fully get. Can you explain that one?
Sure. So cold starts, it's definitely something to be aware of, especially depending on the kind of application you're building. Basically, when a serverless function, one of those little workers we talked about, hasn't been used for a while, it goes into like a little hibernation mode. It's not completely shut down, but it's not fully active either.
So it's taking a little nap, like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Exactly, taking a nap. And then when it needs to spring back into action, when it gets triggered by like a user request or something, it could take a few milliseconds to, wake up and start processing.
Okay, so it's not like a complete shutdown, but there's a little bit of a lag.
Yeah, exactly. A tiny little delay. And for most applications, those few milliseconds, they're completely negligible. It's not even noticeable.
Right, right.
But for certain use cases where every millisecond counts, those cold starts, they can be a deal breaker.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So what kind of situations are we talking about here where, those milliseconds really, really matter?
So think of like high-frequency trading, for example.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, Wall Street, every microsecond counts.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
Or even real-time gaming or some medical devices. In those cases, that tiny delay, that cold start, could be a big problem. It's like the difference between, flipping a light switch and having the light turn on instantly versus waiting for like an old fluorescent bulb to slowly flicker to life.
Right, right. Okay, I totally get it. So, cold starts, check. What other potential downsides did the podcast mention?
Another big one they brought up is vendor lock-in. So each cloud provider, AWS, Azure, Google, they've all got their own little flavor of serverless.
Right, their own little secret sauce.
Exactly. And that's great for competition and all, but the downside is that if you go all in on one provider's serverless ecosystem, it can be really tough to switch to a different one down the line. Even if they've got a better deal or a new feature you really need.
So it's like building your dream house on rented land.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's awesome now, but what happens if you need to move later on?
Right, right. Makes sense. Anything else to watch out for?
Yeah. They also touched on how debugging and monitoring, it can be a little trickier with serverless applications.
Yeah.
Because everything is, these short-lived functions that are kind of scattered around the traditional debugging tools. They don't always work as well.
Right. I can see that being a pain. So it sounds like overall serverless is pretty awesome, but it's not like a magic solution for everything.
Exactly. It's all about choosing the right tool for the job, right?
Absolutely. So now that we've covered the good and the bad, I'm really curious to dig into some real world examples. Like, how are people actually using this stuff? Because the podcast, they mentioned some pretty cool use cases.
Well, yeah, for sure. We're talking about everything from powering those event-driven applications and APIs, like we talked about with the e-commerce example, to enabling the whole Internet of Things revolution. They even talked about using it for real-time file processing.
Okay, so pretty diverse range of applications there. I'm super fascinated by this whole Internet of Things thing. Smart homes, connected cars, like the idea that everyday objects are becoming like smart, it's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. It's like science fiction becoming reality right before our eyes.
Yeah.
And serverless is playing a key role in making a lot of these smart devices possible. Take something as simple as like a smart doorbell camera.
Okay, yeah, everyone's got one of those now.
Right. Now, it wouldn't make sense for that camera to be constantly streaming video data to the cloud. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, your internet bill would be insane.
Don't even get me started. My internet bill is already high enough as it is.
Right. And second, it would be a huge waste of bandwidth and processing power. So instead, it's designed to be triggered by events like someone ringing the doorbell or even just motion at your front door.
Okay, that makes sense.
And when that happens, when it gets triggered, it needs to be able to process that information quickly and efficiently.
And that's where serverless swoops in to save the day.
Exactly. A serverless function can be triggered by that event, that doorbell ring or the motion, to process the video clip, maybe send you a notification on your phone, store the footage in the cloud. And because it's serverless, you're only paying for those brief moments of processing time when something actually happens.
So it's like having a tiny little, like, super efficient security guard on standby 24/7, but you only have to pay them for the times they actually have to, do something.
That's a great way to put it. And this same idea, you can apply it to a whole world of IoT devices, like a smart thermostat that adjusts the temperature based on whether or not you're home, or even like a fitness tracker that analyzes your sleep patterns. Serverless empowers these devices to be super responsive, really data-driven, and super energy efficient.
It's wild to think that, like, a simple doorbell can be using this whole other level of tech behind the scenes. It really shows how serverless isn't just about, making things cheaper, faster, but it's like opening up these new ways we can even interact with technology.
You're hitting on something really important there. This whole trend of like increasing abstraction, and serverless is a big part of that. It's really changing how we relate to technology in a fundamental way.
Okay, now I need you to unpack that a bit. What do you mean by changing how we relate to tech?
Think about it. As tech gets more, more accessible, more intuitive, more invisible even, we can interact with it in ways that feel, more human. Like, we don't always need to know the nitty-gritty details of how it all works to actually use it and do cool things with it.
So it's not just about taking away the pain of managing servers, but it's more like a mind shift from having to be super technical to just focusing on what we can do, what we can create.
That's it. It's freeing up our brains for the more human side of things, the creative problem solving. And that opens up some really wild possibilities for innovation. We're already seeing this with all these no-code, low-code platforms popping up, where you don't need to be a coding whiz to build an app or automate something.
Right. It's like that whole thing about democratizing tech, right? Anyone can have an idea and bring it to life. It's pretty cool when you think about it.
It is. And as serverless keeps evolving, we're going to see even more of this. More abstraction, easier tools, less of a dividing line between like tech people and everyone else.
It's exciting for sure, but I'll admit it's also kind of a lot to wrap your head around. Like, what does it even mean for the future of, everything if tech keeps going in this direction?
It's a huge question, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to get lost in the philosophy of it all, which is fun, don't get me wrong, but maybe for now, let's bring it back down to earth a little bit and talk about the more immediate future of serverless itself. The CloudBenders episode, they touched on some really cool stuff that's just around the corner.
Oh, right. They did mention some pretty wild stuff. It was towards the end there, we got a little sidetracked with the big picture stuff, which I'm always up for, by the way.
Always a good time for a little existential tech talk.
Exactly. But yeah, what were those future serverless things they mentioned?
So they were talking about things like, get this, serverless databases.
Okay, I vaguely remember that. Serverless databases. Like, what does that even mean?
So traditionally, databases, those have always been kind of a pain to manage, right? You've got to worry about servers, storage, performance tuning, all that complicated stuff.
Yeah, not my idea of a good time. I've dabbled in database stuff before, and it's not pretty.
Exactly. But with serverless databases, the idea is that a lot of that complexity, it just goes away.
Yeah.
You basically get a database that's fully managed, scales up or down as you need it, just like those functions we talked about.
So no more late nights trying to optimize database queries or worry about if my server can handle it all.
Exactly. You just focus on the data itself, and the cloud provider takes care of all the behind-the-scenes stuff.
Okay, I can see the appeal there for sure. So serverless databases, that's one. What else?
This one is maybe even wilder. They were talking about serverless AI.
Ooh, right, serverless AI. That sounds, I don't even know, almost too good to be true.
Well, like any new tech, you got to approach it with a healthy dose of, let's wait and see. But the basic idea is super interesting.
So break it down for me. What are we talking about with serverless AI?
Basically, it's about making the power of AI and machine learning, all that stuff, way easier for developers to use.
So instead of needing like a PhD in data science to build something with AI, you're saying serverless could make it so anyone can do it.
That's the hope. Imagine being able to, super easily add things to your app, like image recognition or, I don't know, natural language processing, even predictive analytics, without having to build and manage those crazy complex AI systems yourself.
Okay, yeah, that would be a game changer for a lot of people. It really seems like serverless has the potential to, break down a lot of barriers in tech.
Totally. And as these serverless AI platforms get better, we're going to see a ton of innovation, new apps, and tools that we can't even imagine yet.
It's mind-blowing, really.
Yeah.
We started off trying to understand this word serverless, and now we're talking about, the future of AI and everything.
And we've only scratched the surface. It just shows how fast technology moves, and more importantly, I think, it reminds us that we got to stay curious, adaptable, and open to new possibilities.
100%. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's maybe try to sum up some of the key takeaways from today's deep dive. What are the big things people should remember about serverless computing?
I think the biggest takeaway is that serverless, it's not some kind of magical fix-all solution, but it does represent a pretty huge shift in how we think about software and even, like you said earlier, how we interact with technology.
It's about efficiency, it's about making things scalable, and it's about letting developers do what they do best, which is build awesome stuff without getting bogged down in the nitty-gritty infrastructure stuff.
Exactly. It helps us build and launch things faster, cheaper, and with way more flexibility.
But like we've been talking about, it's bigger than just the tech itself. There's this whole underlying movement towards making tech more human-centered, more invisible even.
You got it. And that has huge implications for how we work, how we live, how we solve problems in this digital world.
It's a lot to think about, but super exciting stuff. So as we wrap up this deep dive into serverless, what's one final thought, one big idea that you want to leave our listeners with today?
I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that tech is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or, not so good things. As serverless and all these other amazing advancements keep changing the world, we have to be really thoughtful about how we use them. We have a responsibility to use them ethically for the benefit of everyone.
Really well said. It's easy to get caught up in the wow factor of it all, but we always have to be mindful of the impact it has and try to use these tools to make the world a better place. So on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of serverless computing. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and a huge thanks to you for sharing all your expertise with us today.
The pleasure was all mine. Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep pushing the limits of what's possible. The future of tech is what we make it. Thanks for listening.